Welcome to a new episode of InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research. CESPA is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. We're going to discuss China. Back in 2012, writing for Council on Foreign Relations, Elliot Abrams ruefully informed the readers that the policy of the Obama administration towards China has been a failure. He then referred to Secretary Clinton's trip to China at that time and said it was a reminder of this failure because it was filled with friction and achieved very little. He then goes on to make his own argument and says, for all its kowtowing, the administration has gained nothing from the Chinese except disrespect. That actually made me chuckle. It's fabulous. Like the US has never disrespected any state, especially in the Western Hemisphere. But anyway, just to stick to Abrams' argument, he then went on to say a far better approach to China would emphasize American strength. So in the next term, which is the second term, Obama seems to have kind of toughened up, and Trump in his first tenure really ramped it up. A policy which was continued by Joe Biden, trying to kneecap Chinese tech through what they call a small yard, high fence strategy. And in this tenure, Trump again began with a bang until the Chinese say, hey, man, you do realize we monopolize rare earth minerals and also its finished products, the cocaine of everything from your cell phone, Mr. Trump, to the sixth generation fighter, that F-47 that you want to make. So how about you dial it down a little? Trump seems to have got the message, at least at this point. We don't know. I mean, you cannot really structure your world around Trump, so we don't know how it's going to pan out later. But so far, he seems to have, or maybe he's just got so much other stuff on his plate, like Gaza and the rest of it, that he's not really focused on China at the moment. But as far as China is concerned, this year came the April conference led by Xi on neighborhood security. It just kind of generally went under the radar. And I'm told, and I'm going to ask my guest, who I shall introduce shortly, that the Chinese language word for it can be more appropriately translated as the policy for the periphery rather than the neighborhood security policy. Anyway, and then, of course, the SCO summit and the choreographed to a T military parade. 3 events in quick succession that appear to have covered signaling from the political, strategic to operational to tactical levels. So the systems at display, going by subsequent commentary, and I'm talking about the military parade, seem to have even surprised those whose job it is to watch China very closely. So what's going on here? Is Xi increasing the RPM? Or will it continue to do Tai Chi and let the US and its allies expend their energies? To discuss this, I have just the right scholar, Professor Rana Mitter. We'll have the somewhat detailed bio in the link to this program, but briefly, Professor Mitter is St. Lee Chair in US-China Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School and a leading China expert. He's the author of several books, including Forgotten Ally, China's World War II, which won the 2014 RUSI Duke of Westminster Medal for Military Literature and was also named a Book of the Year in the Financial Times and Economist. His latest book is China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. I was actually reminded of this book because I read it, I think, last year, or maybe before that, when Trump said to the Chinese that, oh, you guys need to know that we helped you with that war. Anyway, Rana previously taught at Oxford and is a fellow of the British Academy and also a friend of the program. So Rana, it's great to have you back. So very simply, what's going on? I mean, is Xi increasing the RPM? Is it part of the Tai Chi, or is he planning to get onto the what do you call it, the where you run the treadmill, right, like the Americans do? What's happening here?
Ejaz, first of all, such a pleasure to be back on air with you, and always look forward to our chats. We're going to have another great one today, I think. So you're talking here about Xi Jinping's turn towards what, as I think you said in your introduction, is usually being translated as neighborhood diplomacy, but there are other ways of looking at this. The word periphery is also being used. The Chinese term is 周边外交. So it could mean kind of areas that, in a sense, are on the border or to the side. And I think that this is part of a shift that is going to prove immensely significant. Now, one of the issues is that as we speak, literally as we are speaking now, at the very end of September 2025, President Trump actually is in Virginia, and he's speaking to his military. And we don't yet know exactly what the core of that speech is going to be. I'm sure it'll be reported quite widely in just a few hours. But we do have a sense, because there's been signaling, that the United States is pushing much more towards the idea that it may turn its defense capabilities inward, you might say, towards the United States itself, and also towards the Western Hemisphere. And the implication, of course, is that if you're not in that hemisphere, then maybe there's going to be more, how can one put it, liveliness. I think you used kind of upping the RPM. There's some phrases you used there on the Chinese side. Because, of course, China looks very carefully at everything the United States is doing and makes judgments accordingly. And I think right now, and this is my instinct, but we'll talk more about it. There's a sort of rethink going on in Beijing about where is it that China has leverage in various ways. How can it use that leverage, and how can it use it to recreate an Asia that looks more amenable to China's interests? And we'll talk in a few minutes, I'm sure, in detail about how that would be. But just off the top of my head, a few areas where I think that neighborhood diplomacy, peripheral diplomacy, whatever you want to call it, is going to go is, number one, in terms of energy security. I think that's going to be one of the areas where China is going to be making big offers and looking to also bring people into its network, path dependency, you might say. I think there's going to be some interesting questions around security, and where you're sitting right now in Pakistan is going to be, I think, very, very important in that discussion. And I think also a wider sense in international institutions of saying, look, President Trump has been there to say the UN is not working. That's not where he's going to put his efforts. Maybe we should think more about the regional Asian organizations, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where Pakistan, India, and others have been present recently, about RCEP, the growing Asian economic trade environment. These are the ways in which that 周边外交, the neighborhood policy or peripheral policy, I think, is now sort of moving around at high speed in the minds of China's policymakers.
I want, before we proceed further, so, this is something that we discussed a couple of years ago, or maybe less, last time you were on the program. And I also discussed it with some Chinese experts like Victor Gao and others. So there is China's overt, assertion that China is not into aggressing against other countries. China wants to do trade. China wants to have good neighborly relations. China doesn't want to tell you what kind of system of government you need to have, etc., etc. But at the same time, China has the 9-dash line, and China has these claims in South China Sea and all. So I'm just asking you, because you watch this so closely, and you also speak the language. That is where the nuance comes, frankly. Do you think she is trying to square this in some ways? And I say this also because at the parade, there were a number of official dignitaries from within the region and across the region. I mean, South Korea and, even people from Latin America, but just focus Vietnam and Cambodia and the rest. So how is he going to square this?
So I think you put your finger, Ejaz, on exactly the set of dilemmas that China's grappling with and Xi Jinping is grappling with. But I would say, as I'll go on to say in a bit more detail, I think he thinks that right now some of the cards are in his hands as to how to play them. So first of all, I mean, great that you had conversations with some of these Chinese policymakers. I think it's fair to say that when you get the official Chinese position, almost always they're going to be stressing the peaceful side and not mentioning some of the other business, which is also, part of a complete picture. I'm the first one to say that, one should not get, paranoid or hysterical about what's happening in terms of Chinese growing military power, but you also have to be realistic. And the fact is that China now has the second biggest military in the world, including world-class, global class capacity in air force and naval expansion capacity. It's spending, I think, last time I checked, 186 billion US dollars a year on security, defense, and armaments, and that's clearly not just for nothing. And also, there are many parts of the world where, if you are looking at what China's doing, you don't think it's very peaceful. If you live on Taiwan and you see fighter jets coming just into the air defense zone around the islands, well, it may or may not be one of those issues that can be resolved by peaceful discussion. But if you're in Taiwan, it doesn't feel that way. Or one other example, the Philippines, a country which does lots of trade with China, but still finds that China is absolutely using all the naval capacity that it has to push back against the Philippines' sovereignty claims, basically saying, we're stronger, we'll do what we want. So that is part of the mixture, as well as the areas where China, no doubt, is able to push forward a more cooperative vision of what it's doing in the world. And I point back on that front, just because we want to be very objective about this, to green energy. Now that the United States has really pushed back against the idea that it's going to support green tech, and knowing that large parts of the global south are desperately in need of cheap and high quality and high reliability energy for all of the technologies that are coming in the next 10 years, and AI in particular. Everyone's crazy about AI these days. Ejaz, I'm sure the same is true in Lahore. But AI needs an awful lot of energy. And to do that, you need energy farms. And for that, in many cases, what you need is non-fossil fuel power. Well, these days, China has the ownership of that technology, it has to be said.
Yeah.
And they're pushing that very, very hard. On the one hand, it is something that is going to give China a huge advantage in terms of control of the technology. On the other hand, it's genuinely pushing back against climate change, which anyone living, in the southern hemisphere will know is a rapid and growing issue. So I'd say that when we look at China's actions, we have to look at them in that wider context, not just take them at face value, but also understand where there are areas where contributions to global public goods are real and where it's more rhetorical, and in fact, it's more the sword than the pen that is being used.
Okay, so at the risk of sticking my neck out in front of a world-leading China expert, might I present a hypothesis?
Of course.
So it's like China. I mean, of course, since you mentioned Taiwan and you mentioned the Philippines, the analyses in the West, especially in the United States, are, when exactly is China going to invade Taiwan? My own sense, and I might be completely wrong, but because on the eve of Putin's offensive against Ukraine, I was completely wrong, because I was looking at the cards that Putin had, where he was basically telling the rest of the world, okay, sit, and they sat, and he said, stand up, and they stood up. And the moment he went for the offensive, he lost all those cards. So I might just be completely wrong on this. But my sense is that the Chinese are saying, listen, we don't want to use force, but we do have force. And so you signal and you assume that the other party will understand the signal. And just to give an example, in 1961, when Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru had this forward policy along the line of actual control, they went in and they established these pickets, forward pickets, and the Chinese troops came and surrounded the pickets and cut them off from the supply route. They surrounded them for a week or so, and then they withdrew. So China was signaling, listen, we are giving you a face saver. We could have pressed the advantage, but we did not. And therefore, you pull back. Unfortunately, that signal was probably too nuanced for Mr. Nehru and his coterie of ministers. And they thought that the Chinese did not press their advantage because they just chickened out. And they went on, especially on the eastern side. And if you recall, in June 1962, the Indian official report was that we have captured 2,000 square miles of area under there. And that was the run up to the war. So I'm just saying that, this is my sense that this is what China is signaling. But then the example that I've given is that the signals can also be misunderstood.
I think that it's fair to say that signaling and understanding what the other side is saying remains one of the most underestimated but most important elements of international diplomacy today. And I'll give you a specific example to push back to you in agreement with that wider point, Ejaz. 2 years ago, 2023, one of the most important things that happened after Xi Jinping and Joe Biden met, I think in Bali, the APEC summit there. And they had sort of talks on the side, but ones that led to certain compromises. And one was the restoration in full scale of military-to-military contacts between the US and China. Why is that important? Well, essentially, at times of heightened tension, you want more contact between the two sides, not less. And I think it's a sensible sign that both sides decided that they needed to upgrade those mil-to-mil contacts, which the Chinese had actually withdrawn for a period after the so-called balloon incident, you might remember, in early 2023, which caused a certain amount of stir. So I think that question of signaling and how it works is immensely important. But let's link it to the Taiwan question, which I think is where you started the thought, and let's see where that leads. So first of all, I think one of the things that is different from 1962 and that sort of earlier period in general is that we do have a lot more information now. Even if you're not in direct contact, satellite provision and all sorts of other things mean that preparation for what's going on in terms of military moves is now better signaled just by the information flow than would have been the case before. I don't know whether kind of sat-nav coverage would have changed the 1962 situation, but certainly we have more of it. In the case of Taiwan, though, I think, well, again, I'm going to give you my thought on this. Feel free to push back against it, but I think that sometimes people are looking at the wrong thing. First of all, it is right, I think, to look at the very, very substantial amounts of military preparation that are going on in eastern China around the Taiwan issue, on the Fujian coast in particular. Most recently, I mean, lots of things happen, but recently, there have been reports of new amphibious barges that essentially allow, kind of large numbers of military to be transported into the water and on the way to Taiwan. And if these come off, then that will be, a major technological development. There's all sorts of other areas in the weaponry domain where these questions are being analyzed. And it's right that they should be. However, I think that we have sometimes, and I've talked to quite a few military people on the American side about this. I think there's been a sort of conflation between the idea, which I think is probably true, that the leadership in Xi Jinping have wanted the People's Liberation Army to be capable of a Taiwan invasion by 2027, to saying that it's going to happen in 2027. And I'd be very surprised if it does. There are two reasons for that. One is strategic, and one is what you might call more directly political. So the strategic reason is this: just because you can do something doesn't mean that you will succeed.
Yeah.
And let's think about Taiwan is 100 miles off the coast of China. To do that kind of amphibious invasion would mean something of the scale of D-Day, something of the scale of Iwo Jima. There is a reason there are relatively few of these sorts of amphibious attacks that have succeeded, even with very, very well-trained armies. We don't know. China doesn't know what its army's like in combat because, in what I think is a good thing, they haven't actually fought an international war since 1979 when they fought Vietnam. So, unlike the Russians and unlike the Americans, we actually don't have much combat experience to look at. Doesn't mean they wouldn't win. There's a lot of war gaming that goes on down south from where I am now in Washington, and quite a lot of those war games say, yep, China could win this war. But it's not, even with better equipment, an absolute dead cert that you would take Taiwan. So if you're the Chinese leadership, if you're Xi Jinping, you need to be thinking about that very carefully. What's my risk calculus? Now, the second part of what I was saying about politics, I think, is where people sometimes need to be looking more carefully, because I think that points to a different question, which is, What's China's end goal? Now, I have zero doubt that they want to unify Taiwan as quickly as they can manage it. But I think they see other opportunities. And the one that I'd flag to is not 2027, but 2028, when the next Taiwan presidential election is happening. And I think that they calculate by using, cyber, by using social
Yeah.
media disinformation, that essentially getting a presidential result that is more friendly to Beijing is a plausible outcome. If you do that, then you're basically reshaping the politics of Taiwan without a shot being fired. We don't know where it would necessarily end up. But the one thing I can say is that it's a lot less immediately dangerous from China's point of view than actually starting a shooting war.
No, that's a great point, because that's exactly what the Russians tried to do by getting Trump elected. And one of the reasons that Comey is now facing charges, John Brennan thinks that he might face charges, is because Trump is coming after them. But the U.S. intelligence services, various CIA and NIA and the rest of them, had essentially, on the basis of evidence, said that the Russians are trying to influence the US election. So that's an important point. But the other important point is that with reference to Iwo Jima and the fact that, these landings on islands, which the US actually avoided, frankly, after Iwo Jima, because they were really very costly in terms of, the manpower that you lost. But with the cyber attacks, with directed energy weapons and various other platforms that they basically showcased this time at the parade, we might be getting into a different kind of situation. But I still think that maybe this is not exactly how the Chinese are going to play, and I have no idea, frankly. But my own thinking is that they're not going to expend their energy, especially if they can get the Taiwanese investment back, which dropped off, but is likely to pick up again, given how Trump is approaching this issue. But let's talk about the China-US and China-Europe issue. And Europe specifically, if we could start with that, given the kind of disruptions that are happening between EU and the United States, and also whether we can actually use Europe as a collective noun.
Yes, no, that's an interesting way of putting it. So I would say that right now, the kind of great power interactions are in severe flux. And I think that's been the case even actually within the last few months. You might remember thinking back a million years ago, by which I mean February, March of this year. So actually only about 6 months ago, but it feels like a million years ago. There was serious consideration in Washington to the idea of whether or not Russia could be detached from China. Some people call this the reverse Nixon or the reverse Kissinger move. In other words, you kind of peel off the Russians rather than the Chinese to serve American interests. And, that was a very, I mean, again, we're talking about serious people like Marco Rubio making this case. This isn't a fringe sort of thing. There was quite a lot of discussion of it. I think there's probably consensus really in Washington by this stage that this has not worked out, not least when we go back to the parade, which you mentioned. Putin could not have been more prominent than he was in terms of his appearance, both at SCO, where, India and Pakistan obviously had their own presence too, and then at the parade, where, of course, the big three were Xi, Putin, and Kim Jong-un. So I think that, at least for now, American strategists are not thinking of of Russia being a sort of wedge against China. And I think that their attention has therefore moved much more towards the economic. In other words, really pushing China hard on trade. And maybe there are specific Asian issues, I'm thinking Taiwan, which you mentioned just now, where they will still take an interest. But overall thinking that actually it's going to be the geo-economic rather than the geopolitical front where America really pushes hard. And that's where Europe is going to find itself in a dilemma, because, for instance, the German automobile industry is now very dependent on Chinese technology and a dwindling but significant number of Chinese sales. On the other hand, there are actually more more German auto sales into America these days, because the Chinese market is beginning to dry up, mainly because China is producing very high quality, much cheaper electric cars, these brands like BYD. So the economics and the politics are rapidly kind of shifting in connection with each other. What I'd say at this point is that my sense, at least observing from outside, is that Beijing is directing the traffic but not sitting at the front of it. In other words, it can see things going in directions which it finds broadly amenable, certainly in terms of trying to increase its presence as a major trade actor in the region. But at the same time, I think that they feel that for instance, the question of the United Nations, as President Trump makes, a very, very clear statement that he does not think that the US should continue with the UN in its present form, at least in terms of the policy there. I think this is being seen by China as a sort of entry point for them to try and reorient the institution much more according to their own needs. So I think all those sorts of constant calculations, almost day by day, hour by hour sometimes, are being made by all the great powers. No great power, including the EU, I think is sitting back complacently at the moment. Everyone sees opportunity in what has become, a really turbulent era.
So hypothetically, if we were to stretch this whole thing, the Trumpian disruptions, for instance, in the case of the United Nations, and Trump says, "Listen, we are out of this. No more funding for the UN." You think Beijing would say, "Hey, listen, we've got a very nice building here in Beijing, and we're prepared to fund you. So why don't you move the UN headquarters to Beijing?"
I'll give you an answer to the question as to why I think that might not happen. Although I think the idea behind it, if the UN had to move where it would go, I think is an intriguing one. The reason I think that Beijing might be a little unhappy in practice, they wouldn't say this, but unhappy about moving, the UN headquarters to China, is that then you have to let an awful lot more people in. Part of the problem that the United States has had in the last couple of weeks with the UNGA, the United Nations General Assembly, is that a significant number of people who have either been let in, leaders, and then told actually they can't stay or have not been allowed in the first place. And this is what's causing some questions, because the agreement was always that the United States would make special exceptions, even for political enemies, to enter the country for UN purposes.
Yeah. It's part of the agreement.
Yeah. Absolutely. But China is really not a country that is very enthusiastic about letting in large delegations of people they don't like very much. And apart from anything else, if the UN headquarters was in Beijing and the US was still a member, even if not leading it, you'd have to let huge delegations of Americans in much of the time. And I'm not sure that they would be very keen on that. I suspect also, from China's point of view, in a way, having the UN headquarters in Beijing would be too much attention. Everyone's eyes would be on China at that point. I think they would be quite in favor of having it in somewhere relatively neutral. They might want to set it in sub-Saharan Africa, somewhere like that, but somewhere where they definitely have lots of influence, and also maybe where the 5G connections and the communications infrastructure are very much on a Chinese platform, which I think would be something that they would find amenable to keeping influence strong. So, yeah, the UN question still very much in flux, but I don't actually expect to see the headquarters moving anytime soon.
It would be a real sort of, black swan event, perhaps. if it happens.
Very true. Very true.
But, yeah. So, two quick questions, and before we close the program. Sure. One, what is the play for China in the Middle East? Now, Chinese have major interests, economic and energy interests in the Middle East, but they're still allowing the United States to take the lead. Do you think they're happy with the way the US is taking this lead, or perhaps not taking this lead, in the sense that, the US credibility, because of the Zionist entity's genocidal war, is now really at the lowest, at least as far as the Middle Eastern societies are concerned?
I think that right now China is very, very concerned not to get involved in the horrific, turmoil of the Middle East in general. Right now, they can see that it's a huge handful for the Middle East to, the Middle East is a huge handful for the United States to try and handle. it doesn't make any sense from China's point of view to kind of thrust themselves into that particular maelstrom at the moment. Yes, there's a question of oil supplies. I mean, that's certainly true. But it's also the case that there is a lot of work. We started with talking about the periphery. I think China's much more concerned at the moment with trying to make sure that countries in its immediate border areas are more strongly under its influence. And I think it feels that, the Middle East is not familiar territory. Of course, they've had strong relations with many of the countries in the region. That includes Saudi Arabia and Iran. It also includes Israel, where actually they've had a very, very long-standing relationship, security collaborations in various areas, the armaments between the PRC and
some
Israel
of their
actually
companies still
kind of
involved.
work together too. So it's a more complex story in certain ways. Right now, I think that in a sense, China is keeping its head down. And by the way, I think that points up a wider point that's worth making. China does talk a great deal about becoming the sort of new diplomatic power broker, but actually does relatively little power broking. When you think about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, yes, they brought certain delegates to Beijing at various points, or talked about having a peace envoy, but nothing much was actually ever done. The Middle East, they made a big deal of bringing Saudi and Iran together, but actually I think a lot of that work was done in the Middle East before China got involved. So China, I think, would like what you might call the being burnished, the credit that comes from its period of global prominence. But I think in terms of actually having to kind of dive into the weeds and really deal with these tough problems, I think the enthusiasm in Beijing for that is actually quite limited.
It's a very interesting point that you make, because I recently had this program with one of our leading historians, Dr. Ejaz, and his contention was that the Chinese are not really acting as a great power, because they're not going in to safeguard their interests, not just the core interests, but also the peripheral interests, which is how the great powers operate. And this is because of timidity. And he believes, his argument, although I was pushing back on this argument in a different way, but he thought that, for instance, for China not to actually exert influence in the Middle East and allow the closest US ally to actually destroy all the states around it, states with which China has had relations, is something that is not the sign of a great power. So I don't know how you look at that argument.
I think that China has quite definitive ideas about how it wants to deploy its power, and it's sort of what you might call actually a concentric policy. I think
Yeah.
that China cares very deeply about having significant control, political, economic, and so forth, in its immediate area, which is why I think the Asian play that we talked about at the beginning, I think is real and important in terms of what China wants. Once you start radiating out from that in what you might call concentric circles of power, I think it becomes much grayer rather than sort of deep black or white as to what China wants to do. But I think that the nature of the power shifts towards becoming, in some ways, much more economic. So you think about the Belt and Road Initiative, the way in which Sub-Saharan Africa, South America, you get more and more investment. You also get, of course, what you might call the influence of infrastructure. In other words, the more countries that have Chinese tech as their basic platform, Indonesia would be a good example of one that's done that recently. I think Brazil actually has quite a lot there as well. So those are obviously quite geographically spread out. That's also a form of influence as well. And the PLA obviously has much more oceanic reach thanks to its blue water capacity in recent years, certainly compared to what you would have had previously. But I do think that even now, Beijing's interest in control, while genuinely stretching well beyond China's immediate border areas, does change its form and its intensity and salience the further you get away. Now that may change over time. China has surprised us many times in the last few decades, and
That's
I don't think it's run out of surprises to give us yet. But right now, those concentric circles are the way that I would try and visualize what I think is going on with the transmission out of Chinese power, which I should add, just for the avoidance of doubt, is very real, very active, and very fast changing.
right. Final question.
Sure.
Um, what do you think of this kind of disruption between the US and India after almost 30 years of the leaders and the Sherpas very painstakingly putting together this relationship. And then Prime Minister Modi's visit after 7 years and his rather overt attempt to have photo ops and to kind of signal to whoever he was signaling that, listen, I've got options. Having said that, there are structural problems here. If we move away from just the trade relations into a more sort of comprehensive relationship, which also, if not resolves the boundary question, but at least freezes it to a large extent. What exactly is the play here for Mr. Modi and also for Xi?
I mean, I think you've identified there, Ejaz, a very important point, which is perhaps about the difference between the immediate and the local and the long term.
Yeah.
Is it possible for Xi and Modi to come to some sort of agreement, maybe, starting brokering on the corners, on the fringes of the SCO meeting and going on to try and deal with a border situation, which, as you say, is frozen, if not necessarily resolved? Is it possible? Sure. All sorts of things are possible. And I think it wouldn't necessarily be impossible to see that in the near future. Longer term, though, does Modi's turn towards China, short-term turn, but very visible one, actually indicate a wider shift in overall policy? There I would have my doubts. I would say that although, of course, I think Prime Minister Modi felt pretty, unhappy about the way in which trade negotiations and certain issues of the India-Pakistan dispute were handled by the United States, and I think he wanted to show that India has its own voice in the world, and that's why he went to that meeting. Nonetheless, there are structural things that are hard to throw out of the window. The Quad developments in terms of shared naval exercises, which have been growing up over the last decade or so, I don't think India's looking to abandon those by any means. In a wider sense, I think also the kind of growth of the growth of an Indian tech ecology, albeit an ecology that in some ways is still very dependent on Chinese components for the moment, is something that needs, I think, American input and know-how. And those sorts of longer-term developments, I think, militate against the idea that India and China are going to be directly close, and also against the idea that ultimately India and the United States will separate. But I think the ride might be a little bit bumpy for at least some time.
Absolutely. That's a very interesting thought. Thank you so much, Rana. It's always great to have you on the program. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button and send us comments. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.